Welcome to Freddy's Huge Ask Podcast. Huge lives and the stories behind them. And now here's your host, Freddy Cruz.
A person over the age of 60 has a 50% chance of being diagnosed with cancer. Dr. Ashani Weeraratna is a melanoma researcher recognized by the National Cancer Institute as a top 5 researcher, and she's working to end cancer. And Dr. Dub joins the show right now.
Hi, how are you?
Good. So first off, I love this book and I do want to talk about it. The book is Cancer Inevitable? But you've got quite the journey to becoming one of the top 5 researchers. So let's start with how your career was shaped by your dad and people in your life that you personally lost to cancer, like your grandpa and your uncle, and a woman in the book who you talk about, whose name is Carla.
Yeah, so I grew up in a tiny little country in southern Africa called Lesotho. It's one of the few countries in the world that's completely landlocked by another country. And I was really interested in biology. Obviously, in a small school in Africa at the time, we didn't have a lot of access to a lot of equipment and those kind of things. But I had fantastic teachers who really showed us the importance of biological research. I also danced ballet for 18 years, as I mentioned, and one of my favorite people was one of my ballet teachers who developed colon cancer. And as you mentioned, my uncle and grandfather, neither of whom I met, also died of cancer. And so for me, cancer was very present in my life, as it is for many of us. And I really wanted to study it and understand it and prevent cancer if I could.
I love how in your writing you talk about setbacks other than, people, in addition to people who have greatly impacted your life. You talk about setbacks, one of those being how you had failed an organic chemistry class.
Yeah.
And when we think of researchers, at least from my perspective, I'm like, you all make hundreds all the time. You are making hundreds out the womb, and it's all 100s all the time. But you wrote from a very vulnerable place, and that's very admirable.
Oh, thank you so much. So, for me, it's just being open and honest. I came to this country for college, and my first year in college was very challenging for me because I really had to learn how to take a multiple choice test. All my tests up to that point had been essays, for example, and I failed organic chemistry. I always joke I liked it so much I took it twice because I needed it for my major. And, often when students come into my lab, they're very intimidated, and I tell them about my first day as a research technician in a lab. First of all, I started out, my foot had been broken by a horse the day before, and I had 2 broken toes. And so I was hobbling around in a cast. And then I was working with my mentor who gave me a bucket of, something that was in a bucket of water. And we went into a room to image that. It's called a gel. We went into a room to image it. And he turned off the light and he said, okay, pick up the plastic hood and put it on your head. And instead I picked up the bucket of water and splashed it on my head. And he turned on the light and I just looked at him, and then I put the bucket the rest of the way over my head because I was so embarrassed that I did that.
And then you walked out of the classroom and out of the building, and you drove home with the bucket on your head. How you made it home, you have no idea.
That's exactly right. And so, we are all human. We are all vulnerable. We all have bad exams and bad days. And I just, I think one of the most important qualities in science is to persevere.
Going back to how you had no experience with multiple choice, that is insane, because it seems like that's all we did. It's like all multiple choice, and then okay, here's at the end of the semester, write some essays.
Yeah, so it was a British system, so it was very different. Where I grew up, they were all essay exams. I don't really remember having a multiple choice exam until I had to take the SATs.
Going back to cancer, something that I learned about is that it's been around for thousands of years. So I'd love to kind of navigate into not so much the history of it, but why is it so prevalent now? Is it because technology has vastly improved just over the past 40 years. And so we're just now seeing that it's been a problem and an issue that we humans are constantly battling. Is it so? Would you guess that maybe it's the same? What have you learned from the past that's helped you in your research?
So I think there's two key factors. One is you're absolutely right. Diagnosis, is so much better than it's ever been. We have new technologies to diagnose. The radiograms we use for breast cancer, for example, are so much more advanced than they used to be. And also, though, to keep in mind, cancer was first described back in the ancient Egyptian times. One of the first depictions of cancer comes in the hieroglyphics. But back then, people were not living as long as they live now, right? And I think that's why, if you think about our, Neanderthal cavemen brethren, they died by the age of 40, and now we're living to 75, 85, and longer. And so really, the systems that were designed to keep these cancer cells in check start to break down with age as well. It's been a lot of the focus of our research in my lab.
I'd love to talk about that because I have specific questions about that, because I remember there's a part in the book where you talk about older people and their skin. So I guess, and you work in the melanoma field. So people who are older develop wrinkles. And so there's something that you would talk about, and now I'm going to probably jumble my words because it gets very technical, but with regard, it all kind of has to do with wrinkle and the breakdown of skin. So
Right.
Can you talk about that? And then I want to follow up with another question.
Absolutely. So, something we've been very interested in is that a tumor cell behaves very differently when it's in one environment versus another. I think for me, one of the most significant memories I have as like a young scientist was watching watching a presentation by Dr. Mina Bissell, who is an amazing person who works, we call it the tumor microenvironment. So what's happening around the tumor. She showed that she could take a cell from the prostate, which is found only in men, as you know, and put it into an environment that a breast cell sits in, and that cell would start producing milk. Right. And to me, that was so significant because it told me that the genetic matter of the cell itself could be so heavily influenced by the environment in which it sat. And so that's why the work that we're doing on understanding what's changing during aging has been so fascinating, because we see that, as you mentioned, the wrinkles, as you age, you get wrinkles because the biophysical structures, you can think of it as when you're young, you have like this nicely cross-linked fence, if you will. And as you age, some of the links in that fence break down, the fence becomes looser, there's more holes in the fence. And the tumor cells can use those holes to escape from your skin and start to spread all over your body. And so, that biophysical change is very critical for the ability of tumor cells to leave the skin and spread all over your body. There are factors that those normal cells that build those fences that they secrete that also tell the tumor cells to move. And there's factors that those same cells secrete that tells the blood cells to come over and give the tumors more blood and more nutrients and help them grow and help them spread. And it also tells the immune cells to stay away. So it's been very fascinating trying to understand the conversations between these normal cells and the tumor cells.
Yeah, one of the most vulnerable places, it seems to me, as someone who doesn't know anything about cancer research, would be the face. So that when you're outside during the heat of the day and you're not wearing a cap and your face gets all kinds of burnt, and then you start to get these, the marks and whatnot. My question that I wanted to ask you, that for some reason just popped up when I was reading your work, I'm curious. If somebody were to get Botox, does that help because it's wrinkle, it's basically fixing your wrinkles. You're no longer wrinkled anymore. Your face is stiff. So is that kind of like a way for people to kind of patch up the holes in the proverbial fence that you were talking about? Or is that kind of like a non-factor?
No, it's a great question, because we know that if we patch up the holes, as you will, we can impact the movement of tumor cells. We can restrict the movement of tumor cells in the skin. I hadn't thought about Botox itself because the factors that are important are not necessarily those affected by Botox. But it's a great question. It might be so. Maybe we need to give our mice some Botox and see if that helps restrict tumor cells.
And I'm glad you brought up the mice, because something that you had started in your lab was something that I would have thought would have been started a long time ago. And that's trying different treatments on different aged mice.
Yeah. So, I think I'm a big believer in microenvironment. And I think I was very fortunate because I was studying cancer, but at the time I was working in an institute on aging. And so I saw all around me people working on aging mice and what the aging mice were doing differently, mostly neurodegeneration or frailty. And I thought, well, wait a minute, we do all of our experiments in mice that are 6 weeks old. What happens if we do the same experiments in mice that are a year old, which is equivalent to a human of 55 to 65? And we started to see these dramatic differences. And that made sense because it was suddenly like, well, okay, now we understand why the mice, why the patients, we do these experiments in mice that are equivalent to 14-year-old humans, but the patients are 65 years old. And by the time we get to them, the therapies are not as effective. And we began to understand some of those underlying mechanisms.
I want to go back to your focus in the melanoma realm and shift the conversation to your brush with melanoma and how it led to all these different initiatives that you have encouraged within the hair and nail salon industry.
Yeah, so I just want to clarify, I was not responsible for the hair salon. That's actually an amazing organization called the Melanoma Research Foundation in collaboration with another foundation called AIM at Melanoma. And they had this great initiative where they went in and they taught hairdressers what to look for in the scalp of men and women when they were doing their hair, right? Because you don't often look at the top of your own head.
Can't even see your own scalp sometimes.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And you don't really think we're not chimpanzees, so we're not asking our partners to pick through our hair for spots either. But scalp, on the scalp is really an area like your face that gets a lot of exposure to the sun. So I thought that was such a great initiative. And then one day I was getting a pedicure and I looked down at my toe and I saw it looked like someone had taken a Sharpie and drawn a straight line down the nail. And I was like, oh my God, I know what that is. It looked exactly like what, I knew what's called an acrolentigus melanoma looks like.
I'm sorry to interrupt. What was that word again?
Acrolentigus melanoma.
Wow. Spell that really fast for me.
We say ALM.
ALM. Okay, so you found this in your nail.
So I see this stripe on my nail, and I was like, "Oh my God, it looks like an ALM." And I of course called my friend, the dermatologist, right away and said, "Please, can you take this off?" And he took it off, and I was very lucky. It was completely benign. It was not a melanoma yet. And so early diagnosis is key. I encourage everyone to go to a dermatologist annually, at least, more if you have more sun exposure or tanning bed exposure, which I hope, people are beginning to shy away from.
That's something I never would have thought about though. That's looking at your tone, like you notice a line in your toenails, and that's something, my toenails aren't exactly pretty, so I don't spend a lot of time looking at them, but something as simple and harmless looking will be a line in your toenail. So are you talking about a line that's dark? What does it look like?
No, it literally looks like someone took a black Sharpie and painted a line down your nail, but it can also look like a freckle in your nail bed, on the palms of your hand and on the soles of your feet. These melanomas these are the melanomas we find in people of color. So Hispanic people, African people. Bob Marley died of an ALM. That's what he had. And so, we very much encourage people of color to check their nail beds, check their palms, check the soles of their feet. And I'll tell you an interesting story. I often joke that I've cured more cancer on Facebook than in my lab, because I had posted about this experience that I had and said, and I thought it was a good public health announcement to say, check your nail beds. And a friend of mine, I see you checking your nail beds now. And a friend of mine, said, oh my gosh, I saw this thing on my husband's toenail and I thought it was some kind of a weird fungus. And I took him to the dermatologist and he was actually a stage 1 melanoma, unlike me, who was not a melanoma at all. He was a stage 1 melanoma and they were able to remove it and take care of him immediately.
And it's such an easy thing to do. I mean,
It's
just
such an easy thing to do.
look at your body.
Look at your skin.
It's not even a self-check.
Right?
It's just looking.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's something else that I wanted to ask you about, and that is with regards to the breakthrough, or maybe it's not a recent breakthrough. Something I wanted to talk to you about was the neonatal foreskins and how you all are able to take such a teeny tiny portion of something and turn it into 4 acres.
So, it is amazing how cells, whether they're foreskin cells, whether they're tumor cells, how well they can grow outside of the body. And it's a little scary because it tells you that when the controls are removed from these cells, they can just grow and grow and grow. It's not just the foreskin fibroblasts that will grow into 4 acres. It's also tumor cells that we take out of patients and throw in a dish that can proliferate and grow rapidly.
Okay. Whoa. Okay. So not just not just the foreskin, but you're talking, okay, tumors can actually grow up to 4 acres if you just give them the keys to the candy shop.
Right. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, we have tumor cells that have been in culture for decades, right? And have fed experiments for decades that researchers all over the world use. We take one tiny tumor, we dissociate the cells, and those tumor cells can be propagated for decades and decades and decades. And that's why they're so hard to kill.
My mind is blown right now. I got nothing. Okay. Well, so it makes sense because these tumor cells are living things, and all living things must propagate themselves because there's a natural instinct to survive. So bringing it back to the human body, and one of these cells is going to be teeny tiny compared to me, who's 5'9", 190 plus pounds. So you're talking like a speck of salt on a major roadway.
Right.
One cell. If I end up, God forbid I ever end up with cancer, but if I do, cancer's removed, congratulations, you're done. Except for the one cell, that one teeny tiny speck of salt on the highway of my body. And it can grow into something, it can redevelop, regrow, regenerate into something that's going to like completely take me out if it's not caught early enough.
That's right. And so actually in some very new unpublished work from our lab, which will be out next week, we found that what happens is that there are tumor cells that, grow maybe on your skin, and you remove the tumor, everything looks fine. But if we look at the lungs of young mice versus age mice, we see that in the lungs of the young mice, there's one of those specks of salt that's just sitting there, not doing anything. And it's the same initially in the age mice, but after a few weeks, that speck of salt has taken over the whole highway. And we see that it's what's happening in that age lung microenvironment that is causing those cells to grow out like crazy. And so, it is fascinating. There's these data that show that transplant patients who receive an organ from someone who had melanoma, was declared melanoma free, didn't have a recurrence for years, and then maybe died in a car accident, donates their organs to a recipient who's now on immunosuppressive therapy, that organ develops melanoma, and you can genetically trace those cells back to the original recipient rather than the donor. There are also people who get transplants who develop cancer because they're on immunosuppressive therapy, so their own cells become tumors. But those stories of those patients receiving transplant organs that have these cells that were a speck of salt until we until we suppress the immune system and allowed them to grow is fascinating. And I think it set the guidelines for, if you've ever had cancer, you don't donate organs, right?
Yeah, it raises a bunch of questions. And I would actually be concerned if this was somebody in my family who was a potential was seeking to get an organ from somebody. Is like, is there anybody? Okay, forget the actual donor, but what about within the family? Because we all know cancer is hereditary, if with your immediate family.
Yeah. Yeah, it is definitely the whole tumor dormancy and the impact of aging on these we call it tumor dormancy, which means the tumor cells have gone to sleep. And the impact of age on the awakening of those cells and their growing, has been such a fascinating study.
Which is why you get screened after a certain age.
That's right. It's so important.
Yeah. Well, and building on prevention, you've got some very easy tips in the book, quite easy. But what's one actionable thing people listening right now they can do in less than an hour?
Well, for melanoma, wear your sunscreen, wear your UV protective clothing, don't go to tanning beds, and protect yourself, reapply. We get a lot of that too. I joke that my friends avoid me all summer because they don't want me to see their tan skin and their sunburned skin. And then they'll be like, but I put my sunblock on. And I say, but did you reapply?
And were you out between the hours of 10 and 3?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so they all avoid me. So it's just simpler for them. But also, 20 to 30 minutes of exercise, as simple as taking a walk every day, is so important. And also, cutting back on sugar is so important as well.
I want to end this on a positive note, Dr. Weeraratna, because this is all scary. I mean, we're learning that tumors can grow into 4-acre masses. Okay. This is like the stuff of nightmares, there's something in there that there's something that I read. It's researchers are, quote, whispering the word cure. So I'd love to know what makes you optimistic.
So, in a way, it's kind of why I wrote the book. We're in the middle of this horrible pandemic. Everything felt very dark and depressing. And as a cancer researcher, I have people saying to me all the time, you work so hard, we never see you. Why is there no cure? Why don't you have a cure for cancer yet? And so, and what I tell them is how far we've come. So if a stage 4 melanoma patient walked through the door 10 years ago, we would tell them to get their affairs in order, right? And now 25 to 30% of those patients are basically cured of their disease. And it is just fascinating to watch how far we've come. I think what's important to know too is that the basic scientific discoveries that are now implemented into the clinic are scientific discoveries that were made 25 to 30 years ago that are now being harnessed and, put into therapies. And something I think that's very important, it's why I think President Biden's Moonshot Initiative is so important, because the COVID response showed us what we can do if we corral resources and get everyone on the same page towards a common goal. We had vaccines in a record time, again, based on research that happened 25 to 30 years before, but still they were able to harness those resources and researchers to have vaccines. And I really hope we can do the same for cancer, but we've come so far. A breast cancer diagnosis is no longer a death sentence. Even melanoma is no longer a death sentence, and people are living good lives, even though they have cancer. And we hope to continue to improve that.
Okay. I have another question, because you talk about breast cancer and melanoma being easily curable. They're not death sentences. So I'd love to ask, when do you think, or do you see, like, what's the prognosis for pancreatic cancer? Because that one is just,
that's a tough one.
It's tough.
Yeah. Again, we're looking at, actually, pancreatic cancer is the other cancer I work on in collaboration with my amazing colleague, Liz Jaffe here at Hopkins. And that's another one that we're looking at, what's happening during aging. Because again, a lot of those cancers develop in older patients, and we're beginning to unravel some of the changes that are happening in aging that make those tumors less responsive to therapy, less responsive to immunotherapy. So hopefully I'll have a few answers for you if we do this again in 5 years.
Love it. Where do people learn more about you and your work?
You're welcome to follow me on Twitter at Ashani TW. You're also welcome to check out my website at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. And of course, the book is available on Amazon and at Johns Hopkins Wavelength Press.
And that book is Cancer Inevitable by Dr. Ashani Weeraratna. And this is Freddy's Huge Ask podcast. What is your huge ask of our friends listening right now?
My huge ask is that when you're getting sources of information, make sure they're reliable sources and they're not misinformation. I think there's so much, I get people emailing me all the time, especially my family in Asia saying, hey, there's this cute fruit that cures cancer. Should I eat it? And I say, the fruit's not going to hurt you, but it's not going to cure your cancer. So please, don't deal with misinformation. Look for reliable sources and wear your sunscreen and stay out of the sun. That's my huge ask.
Dr. Weeraratna, I really appreciate you taking the time to join the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Cool. Oh my God, this is great.
All right.
Mind blown. I love it.
Thank you. You're very kind.
This is so cool. I mean, and let me tell you,